Okay, so let's take a look at how we can achieve this micro interaction for the social icons in the header of Squarespace 7.1. Now, keep in mind that this is an illusion. We're not really going to be drawing the border of the icon. We're just going to make it look like that's what's happening. On the left side, it looks like the four corners of that border are sort of stretching out to meet the other ones inside that square. But what's actually happening is something different. We have an extra element in there covering those parts of the border that we don't want to see on load. And then on hover, what's happening is that that diamond is reducing its size, and therefore it's allowing us to see the rest of the border. So in order to achieve this illusion, we need to have a couple of things in place. We need to work with the social header icons that don't have any sort of border applied to them, a large icon size. And one final thing, and this is very important, this customization is going to work for those header styles that have a background applied to them. Otherwise, you're going to see the trick behind the illusion. All right, so with all of that out of the way, let me show you what I have already set up in here in the code, and then we're going to jump into how to create the actual hover mode. So this initial icon setup that I have here is just meant to create the border that we're going to be using in our customization. So I have mine set up as 1 pixel because I want it to be fairly thin. I have it set to solid, and then instead of using a regular hex code or RGB color, I'm using the variable instead that Squarespace uses to apply the color for the links inside the header. Now, the other thing that I have in place is a border radius of 5 pixels, and I also have a couple of flexbox properties in here just to make sure that the icon stays in the middle of that container. Because the other thing that I'm doing in order to create enough space or enough separation between the icon and the edge of the border is to reduce the size of the SVG itself. So that's why I said in the beginning that it's easier to work with a larger number, because if you were to reduce the SVGs to 50% and you're working with something like 20 pixels, then you're gonna have really, really tiny icons. Now, apart from that, the other thing that I added in here was the position of relative and the set index of 10 because of how we're going to set up the trick. We're gonna do this in 3 steps. First, we're going to look for a container that we can target inside the HTML where we can attach that new element. Second, we're going to set up the initial state that that diamond is going to have, which is what we're going to see on page load. And third, we're going to create the hover mode that is going to make changes to that diamond so that we can actually get that final animation. So let's start by looking at how we can target these icons. Each of these icons is an A element and they all share the same kind of classes. I'm going to target these through the class of header icon. And then because I only want this customization to apply to desktop, I'm also going to be including another class that belongs to a parent container that tells the browser that this should only apply on desktop. Let's go ahead and set up our selector down here. Now, we're going to be creating a pseudo element. That is going to be our diamond. So I'm going to be creating here a before pseudo element. And as always, the first thing we need to do with the pseudo element is give it a content property. Now I'm going to keep this one empty because what I want to do is create an empty container that only has a background color. So once I have that there, I'm going to set the height and the width of this element. And because I want it to overlap with the SVG icon, I'm going to set this to position absolute. And for now, I'm going to align it to left 0 and top 0. Now, at the moment, we're not really seeing anything, so let's give this a quick background color so that we can see what's going on. All right, perfect. So now that we tackled this first part, let's go ahead and set up the initial state of the diamond. First, we need to rotate it because right now it's just a rectangle. So let's use transform, rotate 45 degrees. And just like that, we have our diamond. In fact, if I were to set this up as white, now we get that initial state for the icons. We have a little bit of the border sort of erased from the screen, even though we already know that's not what's happening. Now you could absolutely work with the diamond as it is right now, but I actually want to show you how you can make the diamond a little bit bigger in case you want to have smaller corners on page load. So to be able to make this diamond bigger, we need to do a couple of things. First, we need to edit the height and the width, And keep in mind that this height and width is in reference to the whole icon container. So 100% is 100% of the height and the width of that little square. So using that as a reference, if you want to make it a little bit bigger, we could do something like 110% or 120%. Now doing that, let's put this back as red. You're going to see how the diamond is no longer in the middle of the container. So to be able to center this, again, if you're going to be using a number that's different from 100%, what you need to do is modify the position of the element. So we're going to do that by setting top and left as 50% and then going into the transform property and using the translate trick. So translate minus 50%, minus 50%. Let's change the color of this element back to white. And you can see how the corners are now smaller than they were before. Now, once you're happy with how much of the corners are actually showing up in your icons, then we can move on to step 3, which is creating the hover mode. Now, to create the hover mode, we're going to be using the same container where we're attaching our pseudo-element as the trigger for it. So here is where we get to decide what happens to that diamond. In the demo that I showed you, what I'm doing is simply reducing the size of that element. And I'm doing that through the transform property once more using the scale function. So here we're going to keep the translate as minus 50% and minus 50% because we don't want the diamond to move from where it is. We're going to keep that rotation of 45 degrees, but we're going to add in a scale of 0. And once we do that, you can see that if we stand over this container, we pretty much get the border showing up. Now, right now, it looks a little bit clunky because we haven't set up a transition to change from that transform, translate, rotate to transform, translate, rotate, and scale. So let's do that really quickly here. We're going to set a transition that is going to affect the transform property. We're going to set this 2.5 seconds, but you can adjust that to your liking. And now you can see how that diamond is becoming smaller and therefore allowing us to see the rest of the border. If I were to change the color of this again, you can see it more clearly. So if I go into that icon, you can see how, again, it's just a matter of the diamond reducing in size and pretty much disappearing from the screen. Now, the cool thing about this effect, besides the fact that it's cool on its own, is that you can actually keep modifying things. So let's say that, for example, we don't want the diamond to just scale, we actually want it to rotate. I'm gonna set this to 360 degrees. And then what's going to happen is that the diamond is still going to shrink down because we kept the scale of 0, but it's also going to rotate at the same time. So now if I put this back as white to blend in with the heather background, then we get this effect where it looks like the border is sort of drawing across this is kind of weird, but it's drawing alongside the whole container. It's not just matching corners with corners. Now, before we wrap this up, I have one additional tip for you. If you want to make sure that the element has the same color that the solid heather has, regardless of if you decide to change it later on, what you can do is work with the same color variable that Squarespace is using to set up the color of the heather. So let me show you where you can find that. Here, if we go all the way up to the heather element, so here, you can see that this is the whole heather element. You're going to notice that on the right side, we have a couple of variables. These are the ones that Squarespace is using for the header specifically, based on the different colors that you have set through the color themes or through the header settings. So here in this case, what we can use is this solid header background variable. You're going to see that if I were to change this to a different color, that changes the color of the header. So if you change that, typed in red, but it doesn't matter. So if you change that in the settings of the header itself, of that area, this variable is going to be updated. So what we can do is grab that variable and use that in here in our CSS, inside the parentheses. There we go. And now if we were to change the color of the header, the color of that square element is also going to be modified without you having to hop back into the code. All right, and that's everything that I have for you today. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I had lots of fun creating this micro interaction and I can't wait to implement it on a client site. If you found this helpful, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up or let me know in the comments down below. In any case, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.